All right, hey guys, this is going to be our second lesson in Unit 4. And we're talking about the Monroe Presidency during this so-called era of good feelings. In 1819, we're going to have an economic depression. Now, this is sometimes referred to by historians as the first Great Depression, but it's not going to be the Great Depression. That is only one event, and that was from 1929, really 1930, until World War II. That was the Great Depression. We are also having a really hard economic time during this global pandemic in 2020, but that is specifically because of the pandemic. This 1819 depression is when you're going to see a lot of businesses fail. People will become unemployed. Many farms will be lost, like families will lose their family farm. And this is in response to kind of a few things that were going on at this time. First off, remember that the War of 1812 actually ended in 1815, because historians are the worst at naming things. And so in 1815, there was this big rush to kind of get things back to normal. And you always see a bit of an economic slide after a war as the economy readjusts. And so in Europe, this was at the conclusion of their Napoleonic Wars. You know, Napoleon and Waterloo and all that was happening in like around 1815. And so as Europe's fighting kind of ended, their economy was left in shambles in many places, and the high manufacturing rate of all the food and supplies and weapons and everything else, it really had nowhere to go. So in America, we have a good solid market, a number of people that are willing to buy stuff. And so a lot of these cheap European, especially British goods are going to flock to the American market and kind of make everything a lot cheaper, which is great for consumers, but that makes it really hard on American businesses to compete with those cheap European goods. And so a lot of American businesses, they go down for that reason. Same thing with cotton production. This is during the time period when king cotton starts to become the major crop of the South. What the Southern economy is going to rely on is cotton, okay? And Britain is not going to be needing as much. There's a huge cotton price drop, and that is going to hurt the Southern economy at a time when people are going crazy trying to buy as much land out west as possible to have more acreages to plant cotton on. Cotton prices tumult. They go straight down. So a lot of this had to do with the natural cycle at the end of a war as the economy readjusts. A lot of this 1819 depression also had to do with the speculative boom that was going on as people were trying to grab up all this land out west and really making very poor business choices. And then a lot of it also had to do with the banking system in the United States. The first Bank of the United States was chartered for 20 years. In 1811, they couldn't agree on rechartering it. Now remember, First Bank of the United States, that was also part of Alexander Hamilton's whatever financial plan as our first Secretary of Treasury under Washington. One of those things that he wanted was a national bank to, that's where the government's bank would go in. That's where our money would go in. That would regulate the bills and do out the loans, the interest rates, our nation's banking. So that ended, the first national bank ended without any resolution. And then at the end of Madison's presidency, finally in 1816, they recharter it. So this becomes the second Bank of the United States, or second bus, as they call it, Bank of the United States. And the second Bank of the United States, it was allowing a lot of state banks to be chartered after the War of 1812 to hand out all of these loans to investors who were buying up all of this speculative land out west for the cotton industry and the cotton boom. And of course, many of these deals do not pay off. And once the Bank of the United States, seeing the problems that it's having with its specie money, its hard money, and with this cotton prices dropping and everything else, when the Bank of the United States goes to call in its loans to its state banks, the state banks, they go to call in their loans from these farmers and investors, and These other people, nobody has the money. And so that's where you end up in this depression. And then again, it is a depression. A lot of people lose their jobs. And who are they going to blame? They're going to be really mad at the banks and the Eastern interests. They blame them. And so because there's all this hate on the banks, you're going to see states such as Maryland try to tax the local branches of the federal, second bank of the United States in their state. And that becomes the setting for the Supreme Court case of McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819. The state of Maryland's trying to tax the branch of the Bank of the United States there because the Bank of the United States, they blame for causing this economic depression, people losing their jobs. And Chief Justice John Marshall, remember, he is a Federalist. He was one of those last minute appointments by John Adams when John Adams was leaving the White House in 1800. John Marshall is going to assert, as he often does, that Federalist viewpoint, the power of the federal government over the state government. And so John Marshall says that the state of Maryland does not have the authority under the Constitution to tax the National Bank of the United States or any of its branches. And so in doing this, he reaffirms the idea of federalism, the supremacy of the Constitution and the national government, and also lays down that kind of more loose interpretation of the Constitution, justifying this creation of the second Bank of the United States off of that clause in Article 1 of the Constitution that says Congress shall have the power to make all laws necessary and proper for the functioning of the government, which includes, in a loose interpretation, the power of Congress to create a bank so that our nation can have a banking system and a way to deal with its finances. So that was McCulloch versus Maryland. John Marshall, again, reasserting the idea of the supremacy of the national government, because he is a Federalist and he is the last bastion of Federalist power left in our government now that the War of 1812 is over. The Hartford Convention, remember, most of the Federalists are no longer in power. It's just him on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court members serve for life. Rest in peace, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Okay, so this brings us to the Missouri Compromise. I'm gonna try something here. We'll see if it works. Okay, we're back. Let's see if that works. So the Missouri Compromise is going to be when the state of Missouri in 1819 is petitioning the federal government to be admitted as a state. Remember in the Northwest Ordinance, how we kind of created the precedent, of how states could be admitted to the Union. They have to have a certain number of people, and then they can file to have a state constitution and become admitted into our country as a new state. Congress has to allow them to join. Well, you can see in this map down here that we've added quite a few new states since our country began. So we have the original 13 states over here, and now we have Ohio, we have Indiana, Illinois at this time. You also have Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi added. Well, what is happening here is this is the Louisiana Territory that was purchased, remember, under the Jefferson administration in 1803 from Napoleon's French government. And this territory now is having a lot of settlers, and some of it is now petitioning to become states. So this is Missouri right here trying to become part of the Union. But the problem is that we're starting to see during this era of good feelings, even though everyone is a Democratic Republican, they're all the same party, there is starting to be a fracturing, a split among people and their views based on sectional differences. Where you're at in the country, you're starting to have differences from where other people are at. And this is forming new political groups. They don't yet have names. We're not yet to this, this new second party system, but we're getting close to it. And so for many people, the question of how Missouri was going to enter the country becomes very important. Those in the North want Missouri to enter as a free state, meaning a state that did not have slavery allowed in it. Those in the South, the southern part of the United States, they wanted Missouri to enter as a slave state. And so that is the question, how will Missouri enter the country? In the House of Representatives in Congress, New York Congressman James Talmadge, he introduced an amendment to the introduction of Missouri statehood that becomes known as the Talmadge Amendment, that basically, make sure you write this down in your notes, is gonna say that Missouri would enter with slavery, but any slaves in Missouri, once they reach the age of 25, would be given their freedom, basically. And slaves who were already over the age of 25, they would not get to have their freedom. But it was a way to gradually eliminate slavery in Missouri in the next two decades. So that was a way for Northern congressmen to try to kind of get Missouri to become a free state. And in the House of Representatives, this Talmadge Amendment to make Missouri gradually have an end to slavery was passed because there were more people up in the North. And remember that the House of Representatives is based on population. That's how that's originally created in the Constitution. Now, what's the other part of Congress? It's the Senate. And in the Senate, it's based on equal apportionment for every state. Every state gets 2 senators. And at this time, there was an equal number of slave states as there were free states. Virginia was, by the way, just one state there. This map isn't like totally accurate. But there was an equal number of slave and free states. So the Senate had exactly even number. And with that extra power of all of its senators and then a few Northern senators going against this, the Talmadge Amendment is going to fail in the Senate. But the debate becomes incredibly heated. And it's going to become so heated a debate in Congress, like in the Senate, that eventually there will be a gag order placed on any discussions or future discussions about the future of slavery in America. That's the gag rule that will be in effect in the House of Representatives for the next few decades. So it's so bad, they're not even allowing discussion about the issue. Now, Henry Clay is he's known as the Great Compromiser. He is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, so he's the leader of the House in Congress there. He is going to help come up with a compromise to this question of how Missouri will enter the country. And he says, all right, guys, calm down. This Talmadge Amendment, we're throwing it out. Don't worry, Missouri can enter as a slave state. However, calm down, Northerners, because Henry Clay is from Kentucky. Calm down, Northerners, he says. We're going to draw a line right here. Look on the map. At the 3630 degree parallel, that line of latitude, we are not going to allow any future states above that line to have slavery, except for Missouri. So Missouri is the exception. That's why it's in red. Okay. But no future states amidst the Union above the 3630 line of latitude will be allowed to have slavery. The other thing that the Missouri Compromise did was it admits Missouri as a state that allows slavery, as a slave state. It will also admit Maine, which had been part of Massachusetts up to this time, as a free state, a state that does not allow slavery. And the reason for this is, again, in the Senate, you got to keep the balance of power, equal number of senators. And so that's 2 slave-friendly senators now entering from the state of Missouri, and that's 2 free state senators entering from the state of Maine. You keep the balance of power. Now, this does not solve the problem. You have guys like Thomas Jefferson, who, by the way, is still alive in 1820 when this Missouri Compromise comes out, who had said famously that this momentous question about slave state versus free state, the question of slavery, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered at once as the knell of the Union. Like, this will be our doom, Thomas Jefferson said. We have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither let him go, nor can we keep holding him. But I mean, this just kicks the issue down the road for a bit later. We're going to see that happen again and again, starting with this Missouri Compromise. And then every couple of years, another crisis happens over the issue of slavery that they just keep kicking down the road until eventually there's no more road left to kick it down to, and we'll have the Civil War. But that is the Missouri Compromise. Oh, and Henry Clay, again, he's the leader of the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House. He's going to be a very important figure. And like I said, during this era of good feelings, you start to see sectional differences rise. And what that means is different regions of the country are starting to have their own political interests. The South is one region. Their interest is in cotton production, and that means their interest is in keeping slavery. That is what their economy revolves around. So that's the southern section of the country. The northern section, their interest is in financing, banking, and the growing manufacturing sector that we've talked about, like with the textile mills, the little girls and things like that. So manufacturing, banking, financing, that's like New England in the north. And then there is a third section of the country, and that is the West. And that's really Henry Clay's playground because he's from Kentucky. These Western states, it's about kind of competing interest of slavery and manufacturing, but also about land and farming, Western frontier, land speculation, those things. So that's the Western interests. You also have Henry Clay being the sponsor and the guy who came up with the idea of the American system, which is something that I mentioned in our last lesson on Unit 3, something you need to remember. The American system under Henry Clay, and something that was kind of toyed with by James Madison, it will definitely be taken up by future presidents like here, James Monroe for sure, and then John Quincy Adams for sure, is the idea in a threefold way to improve American society. The first thing, we needed a second Bank of the United States, which will be chartered or created under Madison in 1816. It'll be chartered for the next 20 years. There'll be big issues like this, like we just talked about, the Depression of 1819 that go along with that bank. And eventually Jackson will make it his life's mission to destroy it. But we needed a Bank of the United States for our nation's financing. We also needed to have a national tariff to protect our nascent American industry. We talked about the importance of tariffs. Remember, it's a tax on traded goods. If it's more expensive to buy stuff made elsewhere, it's going to encourage Americans to buy stuff that is made here. That protects American-made goods, American manufacturing. That's the point of a national tariff. And then finally, the third thing is going to be improvements to infrastructure, okay? That we needed to build roads like the Cumberland Path, that we needed to build bridges and canals like the Erie Canal and so many other thousands of miles of canals for shipping. And then finally, railroads. So internal improvements, infrastructure, the bank, and the tariff, that is the American system or the American plan. And Henry Clay was kind of the guy who came up with the name for that. All right. So John Quincy Adams is the son of President John Adams. The eldest born, he is Abigail and John's hope for the future. And he has an impeccable, almost you could say royal American pedigree. Obviously his dad is the second president of the United States. He's the eldest born. He was given the best education. He was given a huge opportunity to mentor in Europe and learn alongside some of the greatest diplomats in the world growing up. At just like 11 years old, he's already becoming an interpreter for many diplomats. At 14, he has like an official government role as like a minister's assistant and as like the French interpreter to the minister to Prussia. And growing up like this at a very young age, he's employed by these administrations from like Jefferson onward. John Quincy Adams, he served as the minister at one point or another to Prussia, which is going to be where Germany's at. He served as the minister to Russia. He served as the minister to Britain. He served as the minister to the Netherlands. He served, of course, now he is the Secretary of State, which is that position that was often given as kind of a signal by the president that, hey, this is my guy. This is who I want to be the next president of the United States. He was given that very significant position by James Monroe. And so that is John Quincy Adams, a very interesting guy. And of course, he's very important because he will become our 6th president. As Secretary of State, he is given the gold star basically by Monroe, the seal of the approval. And we'll talk about how he becomes president in the election of 1824. But this guy is going to be very important in his own right as Secretary of State, one of our most important Secretary of States under Monroe's presidency, by basically getting us a whole lot more land secured during the Monroe time period. So take a look at the map. So President Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, they want to see America expand. This is when this idea of manifest destiny is beginning to take hold on America. The idea that we have a God-given right as an American country to expand from sea to shining sea, from Atlantic to Pacific. Now, we did a good job with the Louisiana Territory, but there's more that can be done. And a lot of these borders are very flimsy. European powers are in all kinds of turmoil right now following the Napoleonic Wars. And Spain, who controlled so much of the American continent at one point, is now a dying empire with its land in serious question. So let's talk about the first agreement that John Quincy Adams and President Monroe are going to be working on. The Rush-Bagot Agreement takes place actually kind of just right after the War of 1812 was still finishing up. And this is going to be to finally demilitarize the Great Lakes region. Remember, a lot of that war had started because the British had refused to remove themselves from those forts, like in Michigan and in this area we call the Great Lakes. There's the 5 Great Lakes. Let's see if I can name them. It's Superior, Michigan, Huron, Lake Erie, and Lake, I'm forgetting the last one, Ontario, Lake Ontario, yeah. So those are the 5 Great Lakes. So demilitarizing means that the British are finally going to agree to leave those forts. And also it sets limits on the amount of naval power that both the United States and Britain could exert in the Great Lakes. Because remember, there had been some pretty important naval battles fought on those lakes, like with Oliver Hazard Perry. So that was the Rush-Bagot Agreement, and that's going to do a lot to help us have a little bit of a better relationship with old mama country Britain. The next treaty is the Treaty of London, or called the Treaty of 1818, or sometimes called the London Convention of 1818, whatever you want to call it. What this is going to do is establish the northern border for the United States, not along any body of water, but just to make it very simple for surveying and to eliminate any future disputes. It's going to set the northern boundary between the United States and our Louisiana Territory and Britain as that of the 49th parallel. And remember, parallels are lines of latitude. So this is why when you look at a map of the United States, we have that really straight border between us and Canada today. That's from the Treaty of 1818. Again, worked out by President Monroe and his fabulous Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, the whiz kid. Just imagine that, right? That you're the son of the president, and like you've been told your whole life, you will be president. It's like, you better make that A+ or you're gonna be grounded. Like, there were great expectations on this guy's shoulders since like he was born. He had to live up to it. And he was a super serious, very smart, very, very, very gifted young man, and a very, very smart, serious, very gifted man, John Quincy Adams. Also, look at him, he's so cute. What a nice portrait. Okay. But anyway, the last of the treaties on here is the Adams-Onis Treaty. And obviously, you know, negotiated by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams under President Monroe in 1819. The Adams-Onis Treaty is where the United States finally, we get Florida. And like I said, Spain is a dying empire. By this point, you're starting to see the Latin revolutions take hold. As many Latin American nations, you know, somewhat inspired by the United States of America and our Declaration of Independence, our Revolutionary War, they will revolt from their imperial powers. They will mostly be revolting from Spain, who at this point doesn't have the manpower or the ships or the resources necessary to hang on to these countries as they fight for their independence. And so this is going to be like in 1821, Mexico breaks away from Spain and becomes, an independent nation. This is going to be in South America, Simon Bolivar, Bolivia and Colombia and all these other nations breaking away. By this point in time, Spain really only is going to be able to keep or hang on to Cuba and Puerto Rico. And that's it. Out of their entire new Spain, their big empire that they carved out in the New World, it will just be down to Cuba and Puerto Rico. And so it's in the background of all that, as that is happening, that you have General Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, kind of breaking a lot of international laws and going from Georgia with his army of the United States down into Florida, which was owned by Spain at this time. This was East Florida. And he goes in there and he is going to be chasing a lot of those Seminole Native Americans. The Seminole tribe was famous for hiding fugitive African slaves that would be running away from plantations in the Deep South. They would seek refuge and safety in Florida because it was controlled by Spain. It was illegal for the United States to send an army across that border because that would be an act of war. But of course, Andrew Jackson, he doesn't really care about that. And Monroe, being an expansionist, is kind of okay with his general just doing that. Now, obviously, there were members of Congress who were very upset, but that's not going to stop Jackson or, allowing Monroe to allow Jackson to go into Florida and chase those fugitive African slaves and chase down the Seminole Native Americans who were causing us so much grief. Jackson also famously executed 2 British citizens that he found there, and he burns down several Spanish settlements and basically is causing all sorts of problems, which Spain is unwilling and unable to do anything about. And that's when John Quincy Adams sidles up to Spain and says, hey guys, here you're having some problems there. What if you just cut your losses and we settle some debt, maybe pay you some money, and you give us Florida? And Spain's like, just give it to us. We don't want it anymore. It's too much hassle. And they got bigger fish to fry. They got bigger problems with all these other countries, like Mexico breaking away from them at the time. And so that's how the Adams-Onis Treaty really comes about. Make sure you know Andrew Jackson's incursions into Florida at this time in 1818, to chase the Seminoles. But that is where we are going to basically purchase Florida for $5 million, and Spain is happy to do that. So we get Florida from the Adams-Onis Treaty.